May Jesus and Mary be loved by all hearts. It saddens me to cast a dark shadow today over your name, Dr. Marshall, but you, my poor man, stepped into the arena when you declared war on conservative Catholics in your recent YouTube, Does Vatican II Contain Error? Our Lord said that scandals will come, but nevertheless, woe to that man by whom the scandal comes. Matthew's gospel gives us the Greek word scandalon, a snare, a trap, a trick. Many humble Catholics will be ensnared by that video, Dr. Marshall, unless you remove it and recant. Humble souls are dazzled or intimidated by any man who has published books or earned a doctorate. Thousands of us have clicked on your YouTube videos in recent years because we appreciated your open discussion of topics that we wished many pastors and bishops were addressing. You've been a voice that has expressed out loud what many of us have been thinking in our hearts. But gradually, I pulled away from your channel, disturbed by your criticisms of saintly popes and your obsessions with liturgical preferences as if these were dogmas. I could understand that a convert sometimes has a chip on his shoulder and feels a need to be an over-the-top Roman Catholic to prove his loyalty. But Dr. Marshall, in this recent video, you dramatically slid off a cliff. God forbid that any lemmings follow you in a headlong rush out of the arms of Mother Church and into the lonely abyss of Protestantism, where every man is on his own to decide how to interpret the gospel of Jesus Christ. The YouTube thumbnail and a full title was intimidating, as if you would be quoting bishops and archbishops who, of course, would know the council documents from personal experience, whereas you didn't become a Catholic until 2006, over 40 years after the council. But as I began to listen, I could hardly hold back laughter during that miserable 65 minutes of bravado. Although you were trying to demonstrate that Vatican II does contain errors, you yourself were sufficiently aware of the poverty of your case against the council, so you coyly phrased the video title with a question mark. But Dr. Marshall, that title set a trap and a snare for the many Catholics in certain dioceses who have already been scandalized and weakened by poor catechesis and would not have the objectivity or the experience or the leisure or the sheer confidence to study and form their own opinion regarding the credibility of your statements. I, on the contrary, have all these things, and I'm going to set the record straight right now for the sheeple whom you are leading astray. What are my credentials? My perspective on the council is not a university degree, but a lifetime of personal experience. Before I entered religious life, I acquired a couple dozen hours in theology and about the same in philosophy. But after 3 semesters in 2 colleges, I was eager to begin my life of hidden prayer and penance for the church and for the world. Very briefly, for those who don't know me, I've had a YouTube presence with the Marian News channel since 2016, with over 100 original videos. My story and my apostolic work are explained at the website houseofmaryomd.org. I'm a cradle Catholic, educated in Catholic schools from age 7 until a few months before my 20th birthday, when I entered a cloistered monastery. I stayed there for 33 happy years as Sister Anne of Yahweh, OCD, until I experienced an unexpected call to initiate a new congregation. My archbishop and superiors urged me to obey that inspiration, and they facilitated the proper dispensations. The canonical protocol is to live as a layperson, as did Mother Teresa of Calcutta, who left her beloved Loreto sisters, until the new congregation is officially established. My new habit is designed and almost ready to wear. The day is not far off when I expect to pronounce my vows in the new order of the Mother of God. So as I was saying, I lived the council. I was a child during the closing sessions. 2nd grade was the last year that I was taught by a nun in a long black habit, and that was my last year to study from the Baltimore Catechism. I witnessed firsthand the confusion, the excitement, the changes in the liturgy, the good, the bad, and the ugly. The Vietnam War, LSD, and rock and roll were nothing on my radar compared to the upheaval going on in my Catholic schools. I spent hours and hours with an excellent family, trying in vain to keep them from leaving the church to join the schismatic Lefebvreites. In high school, I watched Christian brothers smoke pot in the corridors. One eloped with my classmate, and another with the nun who was my English teacher. In college, the Jesuits explained to me that Jesus never worked any miracles or rose from the dead. They gave assignments like, go and watch this R-rated movie, which had nothing to do with anything about religion. When I entered Carmel in the late 70s, Rome had encouraged all religious congregations to experiment while we waited year after year for the release of the new edition of canon law, which would regulate certain sections of our constitutions. My solemn vows were pronounced under temporary constitutions, which took an agonizing 2 decades to get updated because 800 plus Carmelite monasteries in multiple languages had to hash out the text point by point. So I should get some kind of endurance award for participating in thousands of hours of discussions. As for the documents of Vatican II, and for every single small and large document that Rome released in an English translation during 30 plus years of my religious life, we not only read them word for word, usually from the refectory pulpit during meals, but the council documents were part of my novitiate formation and part of my life. I was living with a house full of nuns who had grown up with the Tridentine liturgy. They lived through every change personally, and would openly reminisce and share their impressions about the changes in the rubrics for Mass and the Divine Office. I was not living with a house full of liberals, far from it. They could see or read in the Catholic papers the deviations from the actual text of the council that were happening all around us under the nebulous umbrella of something called the Spirit of Vatican II. After my first 20 years in the cloister with only Novus Ordo liturgies, a group of young men established themselves nearby to initiate a new branch of Carmelites. They wanted to revive and restore the Carmelite rite. Yes, many religious orders have had their own rites down through the centuries. Since I was a good typist, the prioress assigned me to assist them in their research and in producing liturgical layouts for use in choir. The prior had been educated in Gregorian chant. Soon the nuns were learning the 18 different masses of the Solemn Kyriale and proper antiphons. Since I had played a modal instrument from my youth, modal chant became my passion and forte. But I won't detour now in that direction. I'll save that scrumptious topic for future videos on my channel. The point here is to address Dr. Marshall's underwhelmingly unbrilliant reasons for demonstrating why he feels impelled to suggest that he can use his personal authority as layman and father of a family to declare null and void either all or parts of a council of the Catholic Church. As a prelude, Dr. Marshall begins by attempting to convince the listeners that the council is old news, and for him this itself is evidence that there is something wrong with the council, simply because people are still talking about it. Any church historian will tell you that it takes an average of a full century for any council to be promulgated and implemented. It's not about the mode and speed of travel. It's about education to help the faithful understand what the changes are about and how to make them correctly. Bishop and Saint Charles Borromeo spent his entire adult life promoting the Council of Trent in his diocese, with multiple synods for the priests and horseback travel from parish to parish to speak to the laity in person. The actual duration of the Council of Vatican II was quite speedy, 1962 to 65. Trent took 18 years, from 1545 to 63. Vatican Council I took a century, if you allow for the fact that it was opened in 1864, interrupted 6 years later, and never formally closed until the first session of Vatican II. So just ignore all his hype about this recent council being a point of discussion half a century later. It's a non sequitur. If you need help, Dr. Marshall, with that Latin expression, you can Google it. Point number 1. Pope Paul closed the council in 1967 stating, quote, "The magisterium of the church did not wish to pronounce itself under the form of extraordinary dogmatic pronouncements. And another quote he uses, in view of the pastoral nature of the council, it has avoided proclaiming in an extraordinary manner any dogma carrying the mark of infallibility. Duh, of course. From the very beginning, Pope St. John the 23rd made it clear that he was not calling a council to address any extraordinary problems, or to evaluate possible new dogmas, or to anathematize extraordinary errors. The purpose of the council was pastoral, or more precisely, evangelical. In 1962, the Catholic Church was extremely strong, at least from the outside, a well-oiled machine, churning out millions of students from Catholic schools, abundant priestly vocations, thousands of sisters, and even an American president. But any good company assesses its own structure and compares itself to other structures to judge its effectiveness. Billions of people on the planet were not yet Catholic. They were not enjoying the graces of the Christian faith. Why wasn't the church reaching them effectively? Holy prelates were anxious about the shallowness of formation going on in convents and seminaries. In the public forum, prelates were asking out loud, how long would the church hold on to its youth if the church clung to the trappings of a medieval monarchy, while most of the kings and queens of Europe were setting these aside to allow the people to participate more actively in government? Put yourself inside that year. The world has radically changed between 1910 and 1960. Illiteracy had become quite rare in the modern world. The laity were off the farm. They had engaged in 2 world wars, and they had developed a cosmopolitan interest in all cultures. Technology was advancing. Medicine was advancing. The media was expanding. The world had a new face. How many people were wearing hats in 1930? About everybody. 1940, nearly everybody. 1950, fewer. 1960, hat companies begged President Kennedy to at least carry a hat, even though he wouldn't wear one. Were priests supposed to hang on to their hats, their berettas, when hats and crowns no longer had importance, because people had no need to cover their hair, since they could afford hairstylists? It's a small point, but it was real in 1962. Consider my Carmelite constitutions that hailed from the 1570s. St. Teresa stipulated that the habit and scapular must be made of wool. It was a point of law. Why did she do that? Because she wanted to guarantee that the nuns would not be tempted against poverty. Sheep were everywhere. Wool was the cloth of the poor. Newsflash, the sheep industry collapsed decades ago. Wool has become the cloth of the rich. What were nuns supposed to do? Technically, each Carmel would be obliged to apply for a dispensation from this point if they could not afford wool. Some Carmels insisted on wool for the sake of tradition, despite the price tag. Can you understand or even imagine the discussions that were happening in the church in 1960s? The council was not called to address heresies. Modernism was no longer modern. The issue in 1962 was pastoral, to unshackle the church from mere human and cultural traditions so that it would have a fresh face to dialogue with the modern world. Was that a bad idea? Of course not. Point number 2. Dr. Marshall takes exception that the council wasn't intended to be dogmatic, but several of the council documents were expressly promulgated as dogmatic. The key word in the quotations he uses from the Pope, which he is failing to notice here, is the word extraordinary. Ordinary magisterium is ordinary. It happens all the time, and we don't even blink. Anything issued as AAS, Act of the Apostolic See, is part of the ordinary magisterium. The church must govern a large body. It is constantly updating and improving and fine-tuning its own documents. How a seminarian is evaluated, how a bishop is chosen, how a bishop behind the Iron Curtain is consecrated, how a marriage is annulled, how a religious can transfer from one congregation to another, and a million other points of ordinary magisterium. The 2 popes of the Second Vatican Council wanted to narrow the focus to updating the ordinary life of the church, not to deal with extraordinary dogmatic proclamations. I assure you there were enthusiastic factions that wanted to use the council to proclaim Marian dogmas, or, for example, to make pronouncements to clarify what the church understands, for instance, by grace. These theological discussions could be handled in synods and in other ways. It was not for the welfare of the faithful to detain all the bishops of the world in Rome and away from the government of their respective dioceses to thrash out extraordinary theological questions that could involve months more of discussions which might not even achieve a definitive conclusion. Point number 3, and I'm just throwing this in because it is related to the question of modernizing the church as a goal of the council. Latin was not front and center in the official discussions. If you can't easily Google contemporary articles about the church in the early 60s, you have to remember that periodicals were still being produced with lead type. Nothing was digitized. Old articles were just tossed in the waste bin. They weren't scanned into PDF files and archived. Thousands of articles have been lost to history. I can testify from experience. I deeply regret that one of my prioresses consigned to the incinerator shelves of old issues of international articles on consecrated life. These represented some of the most erudite minds of all the countries of the world as religious were gradually preparing for the greatest synod ever on religious life, which was finally convened by Pope St. John Paul II in the mid-1990s. The fruit of decades of careful deliberations was the magnificent apostolic letter Vita Consecrata. Nevertheless, the discussions preceding that synod were profoundly insightful. Because so much has been consigned to the dumpster, I'd have an extremely difficult time coming up with printed material regarding the discussions about Latin that went on at dinner tables, restaurants, street corners, seminaries, and convents. How many of you listening to this YouTube are aware that until World War I, most students who aspired to attend a secular European university prepared by studying Latin? Latin was not the property of the church. It was a universal language for study, law, and diplomacy. In French schools, it was a required subject on the curriculum all the way up to 1968. Look at your dollar bill. Mottos of all kinds were in Latin. In a world of lead type and hand-cranked printing presses, it was too costly in the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s to produce textbooks in the many languages of Europe. But Latin was dying fast throughout the 1900s. With 2 world wars, modern electric presses, and a completely different economy, people didn't have the leisure to learn and maintain a complex language. Any language learned will be forgotten without regular practice. I read and heard stories personally of priests who studied in seminaries in Rome in the 50s and 60s and tried to engage in conversation with seminaries from other nations. Their Latin accent was so thick with their native language that they couldn't understand each other's Latin, not even to give directions to get across town. The post-Vatican II church did not drop the ancient language like a hot potato. Believe me, the potato was already quite cold and beginning to rot. Do you want to invest years of your life learning a language that you'd only use at Mass? Point number 4. In a strange and offhand manner, Dr. Marshall criticized Pope Paul's crozier, which he said was, quote, unusual. Did he look it up? Does he know that the artist based the design on the famous vision of St. John of the Cross? The saint felt that he was looking down at Calvary from the Heavenly Father's perspective, beholding his agonizing Son sagging on the cross. The artist who designed that crozier was emphasizing Jesus' great suffering. In 1962, almost everyone had personal memories of the horrors of the atrocities of World War II and even World War I. Both wars were more brutal and deadly and cruel because of modern weapons and means of torture than the wars of many centuries combined. The Shroud of Turin would captivate the world in the 1970s because it too emphasized Christ's sufferings. Today, in 2020, most people in the United States haven't seen or served in any war, and they take it for granted that their future surgeries and death will be steeped in palliative care. I guess the agonizing crucifix of Pope Paul doesn't speak to Dr. Marshall or this generation like it did in 1962. Remember, it was the Cold War era, when people were building bomb shelters in their backyards and living in fear of an imminent nuclear attack. In 1978, Pope St. John Paul eagerly claimed that same crozier. He understood suffering, having lived in Poland through the occupation of the Nazis and then of Stalin's soldiers. It's just a matter of taste, Dr. Marshall. The crucifix design doesn't prove that the Second Vatican Council was off. Point number 5. Harping on the fact that Pope Paul declared that the Council did not wish to pronounce itself under the form of extraordinary dogmatic pronouncements, Dr. Marshall argues that therefore the whole Council is open for discussion and reevaluation by any Catholic today. The hubris of such an idea is beyond breathtaking. Every bishop in the world tried to be in attendance at that enormous council, and each brought with him a peritus, that is, the best theological advisor he had in his diocese. Every paragraph, every sentence was carefully crafted, evaluated, and debated from every possible angle. In most cases, nothing went forward until the great majority of bishops were satisfied. But now, 50 years later, it's all right to say, well, those men weren't perfect, and some fell into sin later on, and we now realize we're secretly living in sin. So we can cancel the council. It wasn't the work of the Holy Spirit, because God only works through saints. Really? He can't work through sinners? For example, King David never sinned. St. Peter never sinned. The apostles didn't run away in the garden, even though they had witnessed 3 years of miracles by this man whom they agreed was divine. No, today we only believe that the Mass is valid if the priest can prove his sanctity by levitation. We won't believe that the Holy Eucharist is confected at Mass unless we have passed judgment on our pastor. After all, Jesus never assured us that the Holy Spirit would be with us to teach us all things. Dr. Marshall, despite all your claims, you are not Catholic. You are like most Protestants, who frequently hire and fire pastors because they find fault with their personal lives, or their point of view, or their homilies. Or the whole congregation just splits off to form a new denomination. Catholics believe in unity, that Christ wanted us to be one body in him. Catholics do their utmost to hold together. Point number 6. Dr. Marshall is scandalized because certain proud modernist priests subsequently bragged that they deliberately inserted ambiguous phrases into the council documents, like time bombs, which they could reinterpret differently later on. That's like a child bragging that he had hidden some chocolate Easter eggs during a hunt to enjoy them secretly later on, while the grown-ups were watching everything and chuckling at his antics. During the council, there was transparency. The documents were not drawn up in secret and voted on by some secret committee, as seems to have happened with the Amoris Laetitia in the present bizarre pontificate, if it's even a lawful pontificate. In 1965, 2,600 bishops participated in that council, in addition to their theologians. Are we to imagine that 5,000 men suffered from sagging intellects and indifference to the bride of Christ, and foolishly allowed a handful of Judases to ruin the documents with corrupting clauses? If some phrases in the council can be interpreted rightly or wrongly, it's because there are limits to human language. Even divine, inspired expressions in the Bible have given rise to hundreds or thousands of Protestant denominations. Before we address the actual text that Dr. Marshall disputes in the council documents, and there are very few, I should say a word about the 4 books that he recommends everyone read. I've only read one, Dr. Marshall's own book, Infiltration. I purchased a copy soon after it was published. Naturally, I first opened to the chapter on La Salette and was appalled at so many errors. What kind of scholarship was this? No wonder he churned out the book so fast. I haven't done a public clarification of that chapter because the project of translating 2,500 pages of French La Salette documentation into English isn't completed. But very quickly, Catholic author and YouTubist David L. Gray, who had been Grand Master Freemason before his conversion, took apart Dr. Marshall's chapter on Freemasonry in a rather devastating video to show that Marshall didn't know what he was talking about. Mr. Gray released soon his own book on Freemasonry, and undoubtedly out of a desire to proclaim the faith on his channel in a positive manner without polemics, removed his video on the chapter on infiltration. If I can't trust the scholarship and accuracy of Taylor Marshall's own book, why would I spend time reading books that he recommends? So, he begins with 2 quotations from the document Lumen Gentium. Let's take the second point first. Quote, "The Muslims who profess to hold the faith of Abraham, along with us, adore the one and merciful God." Dr. Marshall asserts that the document has no right to say that the Muslims have the same faith of Abraham because they adore a different God. But the document only states that they profess to hold the faith of Abraham. The main argument of Dr. Marshall would apply to the Jews also, because he insists that God equals Trinity, and the Muslims reject the Trinity. Therefore, Muslims do not adore the one and merciful God as the document states. But that argument would also apply to Abraham, and Melchizedek, and Job, and St. Anne, and Native Americans, and whoever has loved and worshiped God, without recognizing the Holy Trinity. If God equals Trinity, the argument can be reversed. Trinity equals God. These people can worship one God without being aware that 3 divine persons constitute one unity. I find it deeply sad that Dr. Marshall and company just cannot admit that anyone could possibly be saved who doesn't belong to their Catholic club. Now, his first quotation from the document is related to the same argument. Quote, "The Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church." Dr. Marshall assumes that this dogmatic statement implies that there are 2 churches. But hundreds of theologians hashed out that point during the council and crafted the statement with extreme care. It's congruent with the above statement. One can be saved by belonging to the Church of Christ, which subsists in the Catholic Church, without having ever been a former member of the Catholic Church. These people can be saved through the prayers and merits of the Catholic Church, which offers the daily sacrifice with Christ the High Priest. I have a separate video explaining this more fully. The title of that video is "Right or Wrong About No Salvation," so I won't spend more time right here. The next document he quotes is from Nostra Aetate on Hinduism. Quote, "Hindus contemplate the divine mystery," pulling from a long paragraph. Dr. Marshall imagines that the document is affirming that Hindus identify and worship the correct God when they contemplate the divinity. He seems to imply that nobody has a right to think about the mystery of God or seek to understand the divinity. Contemplate is a very broad word. Anyone is free to contemplate the stars in the sky on a beautiful night. The document is not equating the contemplation of a St. Bonaventure on the Holy Trinity with the contemplation of a Hindu on the sheer mystery of God. And then his second quote from Nostra Aetate, quote, "In Buddhism, according to its various forms, the radical inadequacy of this changeable world is acknowledged, and a way is taught where those with a devout and trustful spirit may be able to reach either a state of perfect freedom, or relying on their own efforts, or on help from a higher source, the highest illumination." Dr. Marshall imagines that this council document is affirming that Buddhists succeed in their aspirations to what they consider perfect illumination. Pope John Paul greatly offended the Buddhists years after the council. In his book, Crossing the Threshold of Hope, which took the form of an interview by Vittorio Messori, the Pope responded to a question: among the religions mentioned in the council document, Nostra Aetate, it is necessary to pay special attention to Buddhism, which from a certain point of view, like Christianity, is a religion of salvation. The doctrine of salvation in Buddhism and Christianity are opposed. I'm still quoting the Pope. And then he goes on to compare the classical Catholic method and the Buddhist method of detaching oneself from the world to pursue a higher goal. So then the Pope concludes with a sword thrust. Carmelite mysticism begins at the point where the reflections of Buddha end. Young Bishop Wojtyła had taken part very actively in the forming of the council documents. He didn't think that there were any problems with them. He knew what they meant and what the fathers meant. If Dr. Marshall doesn't understand the documents, he needs to spend more time getting familiar with the philosophical terminology. The Council Fathers had regard for a number of philosophical systems. For example, Bonaventure, Benedict's favorite, Thomism, Neo-Thomism, and especially phenomenology, greatly appreciated by St. Edith Stein and St. John Paul. Dr. Marshall is very much limited to St. Thomas Aquinas, and that, I fear, is his main handicap. There are a number of questions that Aquinas never addressed because the topic wasn't on anyone's radar in the 1300s or 13th century, and Aristotelian philosophy wasn't broad enough anyway. Now he quotes from the document Dignitate Humanis. The final problematic phrase that Dr. Marshall quotes from this voluminous, lucid, and unambiguous documentation from the Council is, quote, "People have a right to worship in their own way." Dr. Marshall complains that nobody has a right to worship the wrong God, or even to worship Satan. Notice that he's rephrasing the text. First of all, God respects our freedom so much that he allows us to choose other gods besides himself, even to make a pact with Satan, or even to worship self. The men who crafted this document wanted to assert a fundamental right to worship because they had just experienced several wars with totalitarian regimes. In past centuries, citizens were obliged to belong to the same religion and worship the same deity as the king, or else leave the country. That was the historical norm. In modern atheistic regimes, no one can worship any god. During this council, the deliberations of prelates were being observed by world leaders whose people desired respect for human rights as the path to peace. If Dr. Marshall rejects the concept of freedom to worship for everyone except for Catholics, because only Catholics worship the correct God, then he needs to find a very unique country to live in. Certainly it's easier to live in a land where everyone professes the same creed, but that would compromise human freedom and human dignity. And there is no chance for Catholics to mingle with humanity and be a light for the world, bearing witness to the truth of Christ. Many saints spent periods of their lives in a wrong religion, or even in agnosticism, as they felt their way forward to the Catholic Church. Dr. Marshall, you yourself were living in the wrong religion. Look at St. Augustine. He could dialogue so well because he knew the pagan philosophies from the inside. Great saints like Edith Stein would not be allowed to encounter Catholics during her search for the truth because they would all be living in Catholic land where no one but Catholics may enter. Jesus said that the truth will set us free. People need to be free to seek the truth. Finally, he makes a plea for the phantom of the liturgical hermeneutic of continuity. Trad Catholics seem to forget or be oblivious to the brutal fact that with the Council of Trent, Pope St. Pius V flattened many Latin rites and Latin usages to enforce a uniform liturgy from the top down. The saint also suppressed a plethora of polyphonic Gregorian chants, which the Council Fathers deemed too cumbersome. That council was reacting to the wind of Protestant revolt sweeping through the church. Pius V, like a general, bellowed orders to keep the church militant marching together in a tight formation. If you imagine that the Tridentine Mass represented a hermeneutic of continuity, you are in la-la land. When Jesus founded the church, the 12 apostles spread out in different directions, each celebrating the divine liturgy, first in Aramaic, then in Greek, and finally in the language of the land where they landed. Do you think the Apostle Thomas carried a Latin missal to India with rubrics printed in red letters? In the New Testament, it's clear that the liturgy was part of a meal. And in the memorandums of St. Justin Martyr, he explains that the priest gives thanks, quote, in his own words to the best of his ability. The divine office was celebrated in such diversity through the centuries that it's impossible to chart it accurately. The Mass wasn't much different in the early centuries. There were many rites in many languages among the Eastern Catholics, and there still are. As for the West, eventually the language of the western part of the Roman Empire prevailed, so much that common people could no longer understand the Mass or read Scripture in Greek. The Pope commissioned the monk priest Jerome to produce a vulgar Bible for the common man. Vulgate, vulgate, means common. Mass was thus celebrated in common, vulgar Latin, even as the New Testament had been written in kitchen, non-classical Greek. Yet the composition of the Eucharistic prayer itself could be spontaneous at each celebration or whatever local custom developed. Was every local custom laudable? The 20-year-long Council of Trent evaluated many of these liturgies, and few passed muster. The Pope asked the bishops to enforce one particular manner of celebrating Mass, which for the Catholics of the 16th century was a novelty, a Novus Ordo. Today we renamed that old Novus Ordo the Tridentine Mass, while the recent Council's liturgy is the new Novus Ordo. How many times have you heard some ignorant Catholic say, "I just want the old Mass because it's the Mass of the saints. If it was good enough for St. Thomas More, it's good enough for me"? What dolts these Catholics are. St. Thomas More died before Trent. He lived in England. He either attended Masses in the Canterbury Rite or the Salisbury Rite, or else he attended Mass celebrated in monasteries according to their particular usages. All these ignorant discussions are the work of the devil to sow discord and division in the ranks of solid, Orthodox Catholics who would not hesitate to face lions in the arena to bear witness to Jesus Christ. It's diabolic. Diabolo is to divide. That's the oldest strategy in the world, to divide and conquer. Together, we should be standing shoulder to shoulder, a solid, formidable wall against the culture of death. Divided will be mowed down. Stop bickering, everybody. Stop rejecting your fellow Catholics over points that have nothing to do with the faith and everything to do with emotions or personal tastes. Dr. Marshall, cease and desist, or you will have to give an accounting before the just judge. May Jesus and Mary be loved by all hearts.